There is a moment just before something is found, when a place holds its breath. The Cooperage on the edge of Brackenhollow had been doing that for 60 years. The roof had come in on one side. The yard was a deep mat of leaf matter and broken slate. The smell of old oak rose through the floor like something that never quite decided to leave. And underneath that floor, in a vault unopened since 1964, 41 casks sat in the dark, slowly becoming something extraordinary. Nobody in the village knew. Nobody had thought to ask. The building had stood there at the end of the lane, sagging gently toward the earth, waiting. The woman who unlocked the gate that morning was 71 years old. She had a grey tabby cat in a wicker basket, a canvas bag with a broken handle, and her father's bung mallet with his initials burned into the wood. She had not chosen to come here. She had been made to leave somewhere else. But I need to take you back to the beginning. The house Edna Pye had lived in for 43 years was a semi-detached in Leyburn, with a bay window that caught the afternoon light, and a back garden she had shaped, slowly, over 4 decades, into something she was genuinely proud of. She had planted a quince tree the year her youngest started school. She had built a raised bed for herbs the summer her husband Jeff died, because she needed something to do with her hands during that first awful year, and soil had always been more honest than words. The garden knew her. The house knew her. The neighbors knew to knock only twice and wait. She was 71 years old, and she was not struggling. She had her pension and her library card, and her routines, and her cat and the quince tree, which had never once in 20 years produced a quince worth eating, but which she kept because Jeff had liked the shape of the leaves in autumn. She walked 2 miles every morning before the village got noisy. She read in the evenings. She was, by any reasonable measure, a woman who had arranged her life into something workable and calm and hers. That was not what Craig said at the kitchen table in March. Craig was 44 years old. He had a mortgage that worried him more than he admitted to people, and a wife named Sandra, who had very decided opinions about how things ought to be arranged, and whose decided opinions had a way of becoming Craig's decided opinions after enough evenings of discussion. He held power of attorney over Edna's affairs, a document she had signed 4 years earlier after a heart episode that had turned out to be a panic attack, brought on by a news program she had watched too late. It had seemed a reasonable precaution at the time. Edna had not thought very much about it since. Craig had been thinking about it quite a lot. He sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in early March and explained that he had been concerned for some time. He had a folder with him, which he did not open but kept on the table in front of him the way people keep things on tables to indicate that they have done their research. He used words like vulnerable and realistic and the right environment and the right thing for everyone. Sandra had not come. She had sent Craig and she had given him his talking points, and she was at home, and her absence was somehow louder than her presence would have been. Craig talked for 22 minutes. Edna knew it was 22 because she watched the kitchen clock above his head and she counted. She had learned to count things when she was overwhelmed, a habit she had picked up in the first year of Jeff's illness, a way of anchoring herself to something concrete when the thing happening in the room was too large to look at directly. She counted the minutes. She counted the number of times Craig said the phrase "the right thing." She counted that 5 times. Lorraine was there. She had come from Leeds on the train, and she was standing by the window that looked out onto the garden, and she kept folding and unfolding the hem of her cardigan with both hands, running the knit wool between her fingers and releasing it and finding the hem again, over and over, a gesture Edna recognized from Lorraine's childhood, from the night they had told her the diagnosis, from the morning of Jeff's funeral, from every moment in Lorraine's life where the thing in the room was too large and her hands did not know what else to do. She never looked up, not once during the whole 22 minutes. Not when Edna asked her directly, quietly, "Lorraine, do you have anything to add?" And Lorraine's hands found the hem of her cardigan and held it, and said nothing. They gave Edna 3 weeks. She spent those 3 weeks being very quiet and very methodical. She watered the garden every morning after her walk. She wrote down the names of the plants in the raised bed in a small notebook, the common names and the Latin names in case anyone wanted to know what they were. She did not think anyone would want to know. She wrote them down anyway. It was information that existed in the world. It should be recorded somewhere. She sorted through 43 years of a house the way you sort through 43 years of anything. Slowly, with your hands making decisions your head is too tired to make. She kept the photographs. She kept the letters. She kept the small green dish that had sat on the kitchen windowsill since she could not remember when and which she had always liked. She kept very little else. On the last night she went into the bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of the wardrobe. Under a folded tablecloth she had bought at a market in the 1980s and used perhaps 3 times and kept because it had been expensive, and she had been brought up not to discard expensive things. Wrapped carefully in a piece of chamois leather that had darkened with age was her father's bung mallet. It was small, no longer than a man's forearm, the head turned from a single piece of hornbeam, dense and close-grained, the wood Coopers had always used for mallets because hornbeam was harder than it had any right to be and took a strike without splitting. The handle was smooth with years of use. Into it, pressed with a wood-burning tool, were her father's initials, R.P. Ronald Pye. He had made the mallet himself in the Cooperage. The summer Edna was 14 and learning the swing, and he had burned his initials into it because a cooper's tools moved between workshops and you needed to know which were yours. She had taken it from the workshop when he died, because no one else knew what it was or what it meant, and she had kept it in the bottom drawer of the wardrobe for 30 years, and she had not looked at it in perhaps 20. But her hands knew the weight of it the moment she unwrapped it. Her hands did not forget things they had learned young. She put it in her bag. She did not think about why. Her hands had made that decision too. She did not say goodbye to the garden. She had said everything she needed to say to the garden over 43 years, on every morning she had ever spent in it and every difficult day that had brought her out to it, because the soil and the plants and the weight of the watering can were more reliable than most things. She had been saying goodbye to it for a long time, the way you say goodbye to the things you love while you still have them. In the morning, Craig put her 2 suitcases in the back of his car. He did it efficiently and without looking at them, the way you load luggage when you do not want to think about what you are doing. Sandra had stayed home. Lorraine had come and was standing at the end of the front path with her arms crossed and her hands gripped at her own elbows, holding herself there against the grey March morning, and she watched Edna come down the path carrying Bramble in the wicker basket, one hand under the basket and one at the latch, and she said, "Drive safe, Mum," and then she looked away toward the end of the street and did not look back. Bramble was very still in the basket. She had never liked cars, and she had always known, with the particular intelligence cats have for the texture of moments, when something was not right. She pressed herself low in the basket and watched everything with her pale grey eyes, and said nothing. Craig drove Edna to a solicitor's office in Harrogate. He had arranged for her to have a short consultation about assisted living options in the area. He was very brisk about it. He had a meeting at 2 and the solicitor had been briefed and it should be straightforward. He said these things not unkindly, in the way that people who have convinced themselves of something say it to the person it is being done to. The solicitor who met Edna was not the one Craig had booked. This one was from a different firm entirely and had been trying to reach Edna for 11 months about a matter of inheritance. She had sent 4 letters to the Leyburn address, 2 of them registered. She was very apologetic about not having reached her sooner, and also very clearly aware that the person who had been living at that address had not passed on her letters. Edna did not say anything to that. She sat down in the chair on the other side of the desk, and she listened. Edna's great-uncle Wren had died the previous spring, in April, at the age of 91, in a care home in Ripon, where he had lived for the last 7 years of his life. He had never married. He had no children. He had very little in the way of possessions or savings. His estate, such as it was had passed through a will he had made at the age of 65 and never amended, to the nearest living relative who shared the trade. The solicitor read this phrase twice, clearly, because it was the operative phrase and it needed to be understood. The nearest living relative who shares the trade. Edna Pye had been a master cooper for most of his working life. He had learned the trade from his own father and had worked it until his hands gave out at the age of 78. The cooperage on the edge of Brackenhollow had been his. He had worked it alone in the last decades after his apprentices moved on and the industry contracted and the world stopped needing barrels the way it once had. He had kept working because a cooper without work is not a question that has a comfortable answer, and because the building was his and the tools were his and the knowledge was in his hands, and where else would it go? And Edna, from the age of 13 to the age of 19, had stood at her father's side in that building every summer and most school holidays, and she had learned. Her father had taught her seriously, without condescension, the way a craftsman teaches an apprentice rather than the way a father teaches a daughter, because he had understood early on that Edna's hands were exceptional and her patience was unusual and the skill was going somewhere in her. She had learned to select and split the staves. She had learned to dress them, the long smooth pull of the draw knife, the correction on the return. She had learned the geometry of hooping, the way the iron and the wood and the curve worked together to create a seal that required nothing but itself. She had learned the sound a well-made barrel makes when you tap it and what its absence meant. Then she had gone to university and married Jeff and moved to Leyburn, and the children had arrived, and the garden had taken shape, and the life had taken shape, and the cooperage had become a thing she thought about rarely and fondly, the way you think about a very early version of yourself before you understood what you were going to be. She was sitting in a solicitor's office in Harrogate at 71 with a cat in a wicker basket and her father's mallet in her bag, and the solicitor was handing her the deeds to a cooperage in Brackenhollow, and she was reading the address on the document, and her hands were absolutely still. She had one question. She asked whether she was free to live there. The solicitor said there was nothing to prevent it. Craig drove himself home. Edna took a taxi to Brackenhollow, 60 miles, and she sat in the back seat with Bramble on her lap, the wicker basket open because Bramble had decided that if she was going to be in a moving vehicle, she was at least going to be able to see where they were going. Edna watched the landscape narrow from the outskirts of Harrogate into the open Dales Road, and she did not think about Leyburn. She thought about the cooperage. She thought about the smell of it on summer mornings when her father unlocked the gate and the night-cooled air came out of the building with that particular quality, deep and complex, old wood and worked wood and the ghost of every liquid that had ever lived inside one of Wren's barrels. She thought about what her hands had known how to do at 19. She arrived in Brackenhollow in the early evening when the light was flat and grey and the last of the spring warmth had gone out of the air. The lane at the edge of the village was quiet. The gate at the end of it was iron, painted black once and now more rust than paint, latched but not locked. She paid the taxi driver and watched the car go, and then she stood at the gate and she looked at what lay beyond it. She saw the cooperage for the first time in over 50 years. The yard was deep in decades of leaf matter, dark and compacted, the flagstones beneath it visible only at the edges. The building was larger than she had held it in memory, which is often the way with places you knew as a child. The main structure was intact at the front and caved at the rear, a section of the roof gone in, slates scattered across the backyard. There were birds somewhere inside the building. There was a smell coming through the gap of the gate that reached something very particular in her, the way certain smells do when they are tied to a specific period of your life, and they have been absent for a very long time. She stood at the gate for a long time. She was not counting anything. She was just standing in front of a place she had loved as a girl and understanding that she was here, that she had been brought here by a chain of events she had not chosen, and that the building in front of her was not a punishment. It was an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. She lifted the latch and went in. The gate resisted her for a moment and then gave. She did not go inside that evening. The light was going and she did not know the state of the floor. She stood in the yard and let the place come to her senses. The stone was good. The mortar was poor in places, but the stone itself was good. There was a caravan on the lane beyond the Cooperage gate, parked in a cleared strip beside a low hedge. She had not noticed it when she arrived. A man came out of it as she stood there, a tall man in his late 60s with the kind of build that had once been powerful and had not entirely given that up, large in the shoulder and slow in the way of people who have spent their working lives doing physical things and have earned the right to be slow. He had white hair cropped very close to his head, and a face that had been outside in most kinds of weather for most of his life, and hands that Edna categorized without conscious thought as working hands that knew tools and had treated them well. He looked at the Cooperage, and then he looked at her. He did not ask who she was or what she was doing. He looked at her and at the building, and at Bramble in her basket, and he made some internal calculation, and then he said he would put the kettle on. His name was Desmond. He had worked as a farrier for most of his adult life in the area, shoeing horses for farmers and stables across the dales, and he had been very good at it in the way that matters, which is to say that the horses had been easy under his hands, and the shoes had stayed on. He had retired 3 years ago, reluctantly, because his right knee had made the decision for him, and a house-sharing arrangement in Harrogate had come apart 8 months ago, with the quiet attrition of 2 men who had no particular reason to keep living in the same space. He had moved the caravan to the lane beside the Cooperage because he liked the lane and the quiet and the building. He had always liked things that had a strong internal logic, and a Cooperage, even a ruined one, had that. You could see what everything was for. He made tea on a small gas ring in the caravan and handed Edna a mug without asking how she took it. She did not correct him about the lack of sugar. They stood in the caravan doorway and looked at the Cooperage together in the fading light, and Desmond said, without particular emphasis, that he thought there was something under the floor. Edna looked at him. He said he had walked across the yard a few times in the past months, when the gate was unlocked and he needed somewhere to think, and there was a section near the back workshop where the sound of his boots on the flagstones had a different quality. Not a dramatic difference, just a resonance underneath it that was not there in the rest of the yard. He said it like it was an observation rather than a suggestion. He was not telling her what to do. He was telling her what he had noticed. She asked him to show her where. He showed her the next morning in the cold, clear light of early April, pressing his boot heel gently against a flagstone at a point roughly 4 meters from the back workshop door. Edna crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the stone and closed her eyes and felt what the stone told her. She knew what hollow felt like. She had helped her father find a bricked-over cellar once, on a farm property outside Isgarth, using nothing but his hands and hers on the floors and walls. The ground does tell you things. You have to be still enough to listen. She said, "We will need a wrecking bar." Desmond said he had one in the caravan, but the floor was not the first thing. The Cooperage itself was the first thing, and it was considerable, and it needed to be addressed in the correct order because the correct order mattered, here and always. The building needed to be made weather-tight before anything inside it could be saved, and the roof needed a specialist because Edna knew the difference between what she could do and what she could not. A compromised roof on a building of that age and that stone was not a job for enthusiasm alone. She wrote to a heritage building trust she found through the county library, presenting what she knew about the building's age and likely historical significance. She sent the letter and she waited, and she did not wait passively. She started clearing the yard. Desmond helped. He did not announce that he was going to help. He appeared in the yard each morning and applied himself to whatever presented itself. He was strong still in the upper body, and he had a farrier's understanding of how things were put together, which translated reasonably well to how things could be taken apart and stacked in an orderly manner. They worked without much talking. There was a compatibility in the silence. Not every person you can work quietly alongside, and when you find one, it is worth something. The Heritage Trust came back after 6 weeks with a small grant. enough to cover the specialist roofer and the materials. The roofer came from York, a man who had spent 30 years working on historic structures, and he looked at the Cooperage for a long time before he said anything. And what he said was that the stone was exceptional and that the original builders had understood what they were doing, which he said with the admiration of someone who spent most of his professional life correcting the work of people who had not. The caved section was secured and then reslated over 4 days. The main structure, once the roof was whole, was sound. Buildings like this are built to outlast their builders by several generations if the roof is kept. The roof had not been kept, but now it was. It was on the 4th morning after the roof was completed that Edna found herself at the old dressing bench with a draw knife in her hands. She had uncovered the bench under 2 decades of accumulated debris, cleared it with a stiff brush, found the draw knife on its hook on the wall behind it, cleaned and oiled the blade. She had not planned to start. She had planned to catalogue the tools and assess what was usable and make a list. Instead, she was standing at the bench with a stave she had split that morning from a length of oak Desmond had sourced at her request from a timber merchant in Skipton, and her hands were doing something her head had not consciously instructed. The long, smooth pull of the blade toward her body, the angle on the intake, the slight rotation on the return pass, the correction that the eye and hand made together without discussion, the shaving coming away clean and even and landing in a curl on the earthen floor. Over and over, the stave thinning toward its correct profile in a way that happened slowly and then faster, and then all at once, the shape there suddenly arrived. She stopped and looked at her hands the way you look at something that has surprised you. They were an old woman's hands, spotted and slightly swollen at the knuckles, the hands of someone who had gardened for 40 years and typed and cooked and handled 1,000 ordinary objects. But the way they were holding the draw knife was not an old woman's way. It was a craftsman's way. The grip was exactly right. The wrist angle was exactly right. The knowledge was in there, encoded into the muscle and bone at 13 years old and never fully gone. Just waiting, as things wait, for the reason to come back. She went on working. Desmond watched her from the workshop doorway for a while. He did not say anything. A farrier watches a horse being shod by a stranger the way a craftsman watches another craftsman work, with professional attention and no unnecessary comment. He could see it was right. He did not need to say so. What he did say that evening, after he had spent several quiet hours repointing a section of the east wall with lime mortar he had mixed himself from a recipe he found in a book from the county library, was that the wall had been bothering him since the 2nd week and he had dealt with it. He said this as he came in to wash his hands at the workshop sink, with the same tone he might have used to say that he had put the kettle on. She had not asked him to do it. He had not mentioned he was going to do it. The wall was dry and sound, and she understood as she looked at it in the low evening light that this was who Desmond was. He saw what needed doing, and he did it, without ceremony and without expectation of acknowledgement. He had been doing that his entire working life, arriving in farmyards and looking at what needed addressing and addressing it, and this was not different in kind from that. Wynne Alcott delivered groceries to Edna on Thursdays. She came from a small independent shop in the village that had started doing deliveries during a difficult period and found that the village preferred it that way and kept on. Wynne had been doing the Thursday round for 2 years. She was 34, and she had a quietness about her that was not shyness and not coldness, but something more like watchfulness, a quality of paying attention that is not common in people her age or any age. She had been leaving Edna's order by the gate, in a box, because the gate was usually closed in the morning. The 3rd Thursday, it was not closed. It was open because Edna had been in the yard since before 7 and had simply not closed it behind her. And Wynne came through and set the box down and heard the sound of the draw knife from the open workshop door, and she went to look. She stood in the doorway for what felt like 3 minutes, watching a woman she had only seen briefly at the village shop, working at a bench with a blade and a piece of oak in a way that had an economy and a precision to it that she had never seen before and did not have a name for. Edna eventually became aware of being watched and looked up. Wynne said nothing. She had the particular intelligence to know that sometimes you do not need to explain your interest in something. You just need to be willing to do what you are asked. Edna looked at her for a moment, and then she said, "If you're going to stand there, you might as well stack those staves against the wall." She pointed at the small pile of dressed staves at the end of the bench. Wynne put down her grocery bag and stacked the staves. After that, she stayed for an hour on Thursdays, then longer. Then she started coming on Tuesdays as well, on her day off, because she was learning something she did not have a word for, yet but that she recognized as significant. Edna taught her without making a lesson of it. She showed her and then let her try and corrected the angle of the blade or the position of the wrist with a word or sometimes a brief hand over Wynne's hand, and Wynne listened and tried again. She was good at trying again. She did not catastrophize small failures, which is the one quality in an apprentice that cannot be taught. The moment that made Wynne fully real to Edna, the moment that moved her from visitor to something permanent, was the afternoon she arrived with a set of used coopering irons she had found at a farm clearance sale in Pateley Bridge. She had heard Edna mention, weeks earlier, and only once, that she was managing without a proper set of flagging irons and making do with adaptations. Wynne had apparently filed this away and acted on it in her own time and her own money, which was not generous money, and she put the irons on the workbench without any ceremony or any expression that suggested she was expecting thanks. And she said she had not been sure they were right, but they had looked right. They were right. They were a complete set of flagging irons in sound condition, the edges needing some work, but the metal good. And Edna was not a person who made a large demonstration of gratitude, but she looked at the irons on the bench, and then she looked at Wynne, and she said, "Those are exactly right." And Wynne nodded and put her coat on the hook and went to work. Word about the Cooperage spread through Brackenhollow with the thorough obliqueness of village intelligence. People drove past the lane more slowly. A few stopped at the gate. A man named Phil, who ran the post office, told Edna one morning that his grandfather had remembered the Cooperage working, had brought barrels from there for a cider press his family had kept, and he said this with a kind of pride of proximity that Edna found unexpectedly touching. A woman from the local historical society left a note in the gate asking whether she might be allowed to visit, and she came on a Saturday in June and spent 2 hours asking careful questions and touching nothing, which Edna respected. The work was not private. Coopering had always happened in front of people. The workshops of Edna's childhood had been the kind of places where men came to talk and watch, and the work went on around them, and the work did not suffer from the watching. It gained something from it, maybe. The knowledge that someone else was seeing it done, correctly, the way it had always been done. What she did not mention to the historical society woman, or to Phil, or to any of the people who came to stand in the doorway and ask respectful questions in those first months, was the thing under the floor. She was not ready for the thing under the floor. She needed to know the building first, on its own terms, without the complication of whatever lay beneath it. She needed her hands back fully, not just the memory of them, but the real thing. The confidence that comes only from doing until you stop wondering whether you can, and you just are. She needed a reason to be in that building that did not depend on anything buried under the flagstones. She had not come to Brackenhollow for a discovery. She had come because it was where she was sent, and because it smelled like her father, and because her hands still knew what to do. She needed to be a cooper again before she was anything else. By the end of that first summer, she was a cooper again. It was Clive Marsh who moved the timeline forward. Clive Marsh was a property developer based in Ripon who had accumulated a number of options on small parcels of land across the Dales over the years, the kind of options that cost very little to hold and occasionally turned into something if a planning regime or a land use changed in the right direction. He had held a lapsed option on the Cooperage land for 11 years. It had lapsed because the Cooperage had been worthless when the option was taken and had remained worthless, structurally and commercially. for long enough that the option terms had expired. But an option on land does not mean you forget the land exists. And Clive Marsh had not forgotten. He arrived at the Cooperage on a Friday afternoon in late autumn, driving in through the open gate without pausing to consider whether he was welcome, and he walked across the cleared yard to the workshop door, and he stood there and looked at what had been done to the place. He looked at the reslated roof and the repointed walls and the organized yard and the bench inside with 2 women working at it and the racks of finished staves and the casks in various stages of completion. He took all of this in with the eyes of someone calculating value, and then he came to the door and he told Edna that she was sitting on a structural liability and that he had been watching the area for years and that his offer, while modest, reflected the genuine difficulty of developing a site of this kind. He named a figure. It was insulting. He said it was generous. Edna told him to close the gate on his way out. He filed a planning objection with the council the following week. He knew the planning system with the thoroughness of someone who had made it his business to know it, and he cited the historical land use, a clause about commercial activity on a residential access lane, and 2 technical objections about the structural state of the rear section of the building that were technically accurate and substantially misleading. He had done this before. He had the patience for it. The legal and administrative cost to Edna of responding to it was real, and he knew that too. She received a formal notice from the council in December, requiring her to cease any commercial operations on the site pending a review. She had not been running commercial operations. She had been restoring a building and learning her hands again. The distinction was real, but the notice was also real, and the review had teeth. She rang a solicitor in Harrogate, a different solicitor this time, a woman who listened to the whole situation without interrupting and then said the objection was thin but not baseless, and that the most effective counter-argument was to establish the historical and cultural significance of the site. If the Cooperage could be shown to be more than a speculative commercial venture, if it had cultural weight and heritage value that the council would be reluctant to be seen undermining, the planning grounds became much harder to sustain. Edna sat with the phone after the call and looked at the flagstones. She said to Desmond that evening, sitting with their mugs in the workshop while the wind found the gaps in the north-facing window frame, that she thought it might be time to find out what was under the floor. Desmond said he had had the wrecking bar ready for 4 months. She said she knew. He said, "Tomorrow morning, then." She said yes. They opened the vault on a Saturday in January, when the light was sharp and clear and cold, and Wynne was there, sitting on the secondary bench with her hands around a mug, and Bramble had arranged herself on the windowsill above the draw knives in a position of absolute impartiality. Desmond worked the tip of the wrecking bar into the edge of the flagstone at the hollow point, and he applied steady pressure, and the stone moved, the mortar between it and its neighbors having given up some time ago without anyone to notice. The stone came up in 3 sections, heavier than expected. Beneath the stones was a wooden trapdoor, iron-banded, set into the floor as cleanly as the day it was made, the oak of it almost as dark as the surrounding stone from 60 years of contact with the cold and the damp. There was a lock. It was a type Edna recognized. She stood looking at it, and she knew what key it needed, and she knew where that key lived, because she had seen it every day of her summers in this building, hanging on a hook on the back wall of the workshop on a loop of leather cord, a key that belonged to a lock that belonged to a door she had never seen opened. She went to the hook on the back wall. She did not know, consciously, that the key would still be there. She went because it was where the key lived, and because some part of her understood that Edna Pye had put things in their places and kept them there. The key was on the hook. 50 years of oxidization on the iron, and still exactly where it had always been. She brought it back. She knelt at the trap door. Behind her, she heard Desmond and Wynne go very still, the particular stillness of people who understand that what is happening has a weight to it, and she felt Bramble drop from the windowsill and come and sit beside her knee and press her flank against Edna's leg, the way cats offer themselves when they sense the significance of a moment. The key turned with resistance and then without it, and the trap door lifted, and the air that came up out of the vault below was cold and dark and still, the undisturbed cold of an enclosed space that has not had fresh air reach it for 6 decades, and underneath the cold was a smell that stopped everything in Edna's chest for a moment, stopped her breath and her thought and her movement. Aged oak. And within the oak, the ghost of what had been living in it, developing slowly in the dark, building itself towards something extraordinary, over 60 years, in the way that only time and good coopering can produce. There were stone steps cut into the earth below the trap-door. She counted them. 7. She took them carefully in the low light, and she stood in the vault, and she waited for her eyes to adjust. 41 casks. Arranged in rows on wooden racks set into the packed earth floor, the racks built low and solid and still holding after 6 decades. Each cask sealed with a bung. Each bung undisturbed. Each cask covered in the particular fine grey dust of an enclosed space that has been untouched long enough for the air itself to deposit its record on every surface. She moved slowly between the rows, not touching, reading the coopering with her eyes the way you read a craftsman's work when you know what you're looking at. The staves were Wren's work. She could see it in the proportions, in the hoop spacing, in the particular profile of the dressed wood. 41 casks, all from the same pair of hands, all made with the same unhurried precision that Edna Pye had brought to everything he made. She called up to Desmond that she was going to need help with the first one. It took both of them to get it up the steps and onto the workbench. Wynne steadied the edge of the trap-door while they lifted. Bramble moved to a safe distance on the flagstones and watched with professional detachment. In the good light of the workshop, Edna ran her hands over the casks slowly. The hoops were still tight against the staves. The wood showed no cracking, no failure, nothing that suggested the seal had been broken. The bung was original, and original meant 60 years of sitting undisturbed in a cold vault, while the liquid inside it did what liquid in well-made oak does when it is given enough time. She reached into her bag and took out her father's mallet. She had carried it every day since the morning she left Leyburn. It had sat in the bottom of her bag through the whole restoration, through the planning notice, through the winter, through every day of the work. She had used it at the bench in the ordinary course of things, tapping hoops and seating bungs, the purposes it was made for. But she had not used it for this. She placed the tip of a flagging iron at the bung seal, and she lifted the mallet and she struck it once, a single clean tap, the precision of someone who had been taught the stroke by the man whose initials were burned into the handle. The bung shifted. She worked it free carefully, and she leaned in close over the open cask. The smell that came up from inside was something for which she did not have adequate words in any register, something that requires 60 years of undisturbed time and good oak and a skilled pair of hands at the beginning and no interference whatsoever in the interval between. It was not a human smell. It was something the wood and the time and the conditions had made together, and it had been waiting in the dark for the right moment, the way this building had been waiting. But she did not look at the liquid first. She looked at the inside of the lid, into the inner surface of the oak stave that formed the lid, scratched with something sharp and deliberate, in letters she would have known in any condition because she had watched them form on school envelopes and birthday cards and the backs of the postcards her father sent from the one holiday he had ever taken without them, was a single word, Nettles, her childhood name, hers and her father's, between only them from a particular August afternoon when she had run barefoot through a patch of stinging nettles on the edge of a field and refused emphatically to cry, and her father had looked at her with the expression she associated with his highest regard, which was not an expression of sentimentality but of recognition, and he had said, "There you are, Nettles," and he had never called her anything else in private for the rest of his life. It was a name no one had used since he died. It was a name she had not heard in 30 years, and she had not known until this moment how much she had missed hearing it. He had scratched it inside a cask. He had been in this workshop, standing at his brother's bench or his own, and he had taken something sharp and he had scratched her name into the inside of the lid, and then sealed it down there in the dark and left it. He had known that the right person would know how to break the seal, and the right person would lean in to look, and the right person would understand what they were looking at. He had put her name there for her to find. She looked at the word for a long time. She was very still. Behind her, Desmond and Wynne and Bramble were also very still, in the particular silence of people who understand they are in the presence of something private and important, and that the right thing to do is to hold the stillness and offer nothing. Then she lifted her head and she said, "He knew I would come back." Desmond said, "He knew you were the only one who would." If you have made it this far into Edna's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The contents of the vault were assessed by a specialist in aged spirits and historical cooperage named Dr. Coates, from a university in Edinburgh, who drove down in February and spent 2 full days in the vault, making very careful notes and saying very little. She came back up on the second day, shaking her head slowly in a way that had nothing to do with disappointment. She sat at the workbench and she told Edna that 40 of the 41 casks were in outstanding condition, their contents having benefited from 60 years of consistent low temperature, the absence of disturbance, and the specific qualities of Edna Pye's coopering, which she described as exceptional. The 41st cask had failed at some point, a single stave having developed a slow seep over the decades, and its contents were lost. The remaining 40 were not lost. They were, she said, the kind of thing people spent careers looking for and generally did not find. She asked Edna what she intended to do with them. Edna said she had not decided yet. What she had already decided was what to do about Clive Marsh. She submitted her response to the Council's planning review in March. The submission was thorough and it was carefully prepared. It included the heritage assessment of the building that the Historical Society woman had begun and completed with the assistance of a colleague from the County Heritage Office. It included Dr. Coates's preliminary report on the vault and its contents. It included a formal letter of interest from the National Heritage Craft Body, who had been made aware of the cooperage's situation through channels that Dr. Coates had helped open regarding the potential designation of the site as a Living Craft Heritage Site. It included a signed letter from Wynne, who was enrolled in a Heritage Craft apprenticeship program that the Cooperage was now formally supporting. The planning objection was found to have no valid basis. It was dismissed in full. Clive Marsh drove past the Cooperage lane 3 times in the following month. He did not stop. The gate was open, and the yard was busy, and the building had a weight to it, now that had nothing to do with the stone and everything to do with what was happening inside it. And he drove past and kept driving. The designation was confirmed in June. She stood in the yard with the letter and read it twice and handed it to Wynne, who handed it to Desmond, who folded it very carefully and handed it back with a nod that said everything. Bramble was on the gatepost, unmoved. A national food and drink publication ran the story in September. Edna read it at her bench 3 days after it published, with a mug of tea that went cold. The Cooperage was described as one of the most significant working craft sites in the north of England. The vault was described as a discovery of extraordinary rarity. Edna Pye was described as a master cooper. She sat with that phrase for a while. Master Cooper, her father's word for what he was. Now hers. Craig came in October. He stood in the workshop doorway and looked at all of it, the casks on the racks, the vault trap door with its new ironwork and lock. Desmond in the yard, Wynne at the secondary bench, Bramble on the shelf above the drawer knives, and his mother at the primary bench with a drawer knife and a posture that was not that of a woman who had been set aside. He said he had not known. She said no. He stayed for tea. She let him. Lorraine came 3 weeks later on her own, on a Tuesday. She came through the gate and stood just inside the workshop door with her arms at her sides and her hands open. Edna heard her feet on the flagstones and looked up. Lorraine said, "Mum," Edna said, "come in then." Lorraine walked to the bench and her eyes found the mallet in its place. She picked it up and turned it over slowly and looked at the initials. She said, I did not know Grandad used to bring you here. Edna said, he brought me every summer for 6 years. Lorraine set the mallet down carefully and said, I should have looked up. Edna said yes. Then she said there was tea and Lorraine could help with the firkin hoops if her hands knew how to hold a mallet. Lorraine picked it up again. She said, show me. And on a morning in late October, Edna fitted the last stave of a cask she had built entirely from first principles and tapped the final hoop home with her father's mallet, and the barrel rang once, clear and exact, the sound of 40 staves in perfect agreement. She set the mallet down. She thought, nettles. She picked it up again and she got back to work. Do you think there are skills in your own hands that have been waiting to come back? And when you consider what it means to restore something, whether it is a place or a practice or a relationship, does it feel like building or like remembering? We would love to know what Edna's story has made you think about, and we read every single thing you share with us in the comments below.